Last December, I came across a set of I-35 performance calipers from a seller who I've used in the past and really like, so I decided to pull the trigger for an early Christmas present. The purpose of this video is really going through more of my planning stage. I want to try and get everything as squared away and get all the parts that I need so I can spend as little time as possible with the car out of commission. People have done this swap in the past. The front calipers should be fairly straightforward, but I knew the backs were going to require some modification. So the first thing I wanted to do is actually find a rear trailing arm that I could use for a mock-up and to take some measurements. So I spent another $80 on eBay to buy a rear trailing arm so I can take some measurements and get the rear calipers to fit. The reason for this is pretty simple. I actually want to use my car in the summer. I want to spend all summer on jack stands. I want to be able to take it on the country road, to go play golf with my friend, blast on the highway watching the sunrise over the lake, and enjoy going to a car show with my brother. Inside the front caliper should be fairly straightforward. A few companies actually sell kits that let it bolt up directly, and you just have to use a larger diameter rotor from the E43 or Z4M. I'll go into more detail on this when I actually start installing the front rotors and calipers, but for now the first step is getting the rears to fit. People have done this swap in the past. This is a photo from Z-Post where a guy made the calipers fit, but no one's ever really done a video on it before. So this is what you'd get if you just tried to bolt the rear caliper directly onto the Z4. This is the rotor from the Z4, and as you can see, the caliper was designed for a rotor that has a larger diameter and also a rotor that has a higher height. You can see how it's actually touching the front of the caliper right there. So the next thing I actually want to do is buy an I-35i rear rotor. I was able to find one on Facebook and got a set off a guy for 20 bucks. He was very confused why anyone wanted them, but I explained the process and he was excited for me. So we have the I-35i rotor on the left, the Z4 rotor on the right. You can see that the I-35i rotor has a higher height, and I'll stack them on top. You can actually see that it has a much larger diameter as well. I'll go through the actual measurements in more detail later. So the two main challenges in getting these rear calipers to fit are getting a rotor that's the right size and being able to adapt the emergency brake if you want to keep it. So the rotor for the I-35i has a much larger inner diameter. The rear trailing arm I ordered actually came with an emergency brake and the dust shield. These are the bolts that you need to remove just to get the dust shield off. And to actually get it off without having to remove the whole hub, I went to one of my favorite tools and just was able to cut it off. This is what the I-35i rotor would look like on the Z4 hub. It actually doesn't appear to have any clearance issues. And then with the caliper actually bolted up, I can see that this is going to work well in terms of the diameter of the rotor. However, the problem is this rotor is just a little bit too high. So as it sits right now, it actually contacts the inner surface of the caliper there with it bolted up. I didn't want to do a spacer between the rotor and the hub, so I went on a quest of trying to find a rotor that would fit. I spent a worryingly long time trying to scour the internet trying to find a rotor that would fit, and finally stumbled across this website called size.name that lets you search for rotors by disc height, the thickness and diameter of the rotor, and typing in the dimensions that I wanted, I finally came across a Brembo rotor that was going to meet what I was looking for in terms of both diameter and the thickness. The height is quite a bit shorter, but I figure I'm going to be able to make that work with spacers for the calipers. So this is the nerd document I created that has the various sizes of rotors that people have used in the past. These are the stock rotors. Someone had adapted an X3 rotor to fit with these calipers. Likewise, someone also used the rears from the Z4M. Didn't go with those, just the cost of the rotors. And then I made the comparison to the actual I-35i rotors themselves, which I was able to take the measurements for and figured out how they would fit. And ultimately, I figured these Brembo rotors were going to be the best bet to make work. The one big difference that I mentioned before too is just the actual disc height of the rotor being different. So here's the side-by-side comparison. There's the I-35i, and these are the new ones that I got. And so you can see that the I-35i rotor is just quite a bit higher. So these came straight from Latvia. They did have what models these actually fit, but I couldn't quite make it down the box, and Brembo doesn't have another website. This was a great moment of actually seeing what these rotors and calipers looked like installed. So as I mentioned before, the diameter of this is going to be perfect with good coverage for the brake pads. So I have these mocked up just with some washers to create the spacing that I'm going to need to get the caliper actually centered on the rotor itself. I am waiting for the set of new rear brake pads to get exact measurements, but I suspect they'll probably be about 9 millimeters in thickness for the spacers. My plan is to get a set of pre-made caliper spacers and basically get them machined down to my exact height. So with the caliper and rotor spacing sorted out, the next issue is going to be the parking brake. So here are the new Brembo rotors, and you can see they're quite a bit higher up compared to the stock rotors. And they also have a different inner diameter. So these are 185 millimeters and the Z4 right about 160. You also still need to be able to use the backing plate that attaches here. That's actually where the parking brake mounts to. And this is the cable that comes through to actuate the mechanism. This is the parking brake plate from the i35i, and then this is the one that is on the Z4. So the issue is going to be that this metal bar here is basically prevented from mounting, then being able to actuate the mechanism appropriately. Overlaying the parking brake plates makes things a little bit clearer. So this has to line up to get the actual mechanism to work. And with that set there, it would no longer be centered inside the rotor. People have tried to modify these plates to make them work, but then you still need to end up modifying the parking brake shoes. With the new rotors installed and the parking brake installed, you can see just how high it sits in comparison. So it's making a relatively small amount of contact with the pad itself. People have solved this in a few ways. Some people have actually modified by cutting the larger diameter parking brake shoes and welding them to the smaller ones to make it fit. The photo I had before is the guy who actually modified the backing plates. Another option I consider is actually buying aftermarket parking brake calipers. The cable that actuates the parking brake mechanism is fairly easy to remove. It just pops right out. And space-wise, I think there's room for a dedicated parking brake caliper. Just from looking at my car currently, I think there's space there to not interfere. My big hesitation just with this is the cost of these additional calipers and the added weight. Companies already make brackets to allow for a dual caliper setup for the E86, so I think this is in theory something I could design in CAD to then utilize these additional calipers. But since I have access to a welder, I think I'm going to go for something even more straightforward. My initial plan is just to weld the larger diameter parking brake shoe to the smaller one. There's already some holes here, and I was going to drill a few more and then basically just weld the metal together there. This would solve both the diameter issue and the height issue. The other option I'm considering going with is actually putting spacers in between the dust shield and the parking brake and where it mounts here. With that, trying to see if I can find a company to reshoe the parking brakes to get an increased diameter. The one issue is I'm not sure if the mechanism would still work, so I'm going to try and do some experimentation inside the car. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and follow along, and hopefully I'm going to be getting these installed in the next couple months.